Hello, this is James Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. First, we have new insight into Texas family detention reveals adults fighting kids for clean water from apnews.com, posted by FlimsyAl5563. And yeah, I don't think that's very nice, but sometimes, there are limited resources, and clean water might be a limited resource. And yeah, personally, I think everyone should be able to have as much clean water as possible, but just because you want clean water doesn't mean you're entitled to it. And yeah, personally, I think the detention facilities probably should be giving them clean water, but it's important to remember that, even if you want clean water, it's not necessarily that clean water is always going to be there. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Ron Paul. President Trump is unleashing a great big ugly surveillance state from OCRegister.com, posted by Duenner23. And yeah, I would agree with that. Personally, I think it's more the uniparty surveillance state than a Donald Trump specific surveillance state. It was definitely saw under Joe Biden as well, with them asking Amazon to censor books that disagree with the COVID narrative, and they also asked Facebook to censor information, and Facebook and Twitter to censor information that disagree with the official COVID narrative. And yeah, I don't really care for when either side does it, but increasingly the government has shown that it wants to censor and survey anyone that disagrees with their official narratives at all, and that's not something that I particularly care for. And yeah, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should, and I definitely do think, we gotta get rid of the surveillance state, but sadly it's only gonna get worse, I think, as time goes on. The initial revelations about the NSA spying on Americans was over a decade ago now, when Edward Snowden did that in 2013, and it's only seemed to have gotten worse as time goes on. Then we have Trump says U.S. has attacked Iranian nuclear sites from cbc.ca, posted by LegioX. And yeah, I personally don't really care for that. I don't know if it will escalate to boots on the ground, but because, the last time a GOP president got involved in a four-letter Middle Eastern country beginning with IRA, when it came to boots on the ground, it didn't end up too well for the GOP in terms of political capital. So, as I said, my prediction a while ago was Trump will, I wrote it down, let's see, wrote it down in this post, prediction: Trump will do as much as he possibly can for Israel against Iran, while attempting to remain politically viable. He's generally been good at knowing what he can and can't get away with at any given moment, and he knows that getting boots on the ground in a four-letter Middle Eastern country of IRA has not been historically good for the GOP's political capital. I personally think, he knew, I guess he thought he could get away with the bombings, but I don't know if he will escalate any further beyond that. And yeah, it doesn't really matter. I think, because Kamala would probably be bombing Iran as well, and yeah, it doesn't really matter who you get. You always end up with John McCain pretty much when it comes to military war hawkishness. I posted a political compass meme on the political compass meme subreddit about it. 21st century U.S. foreign policy so far. Skip to Obama, but you could probably throw him in now as well. And I posted Bush's tenure, Bush's bombs to the Middle East, and Obama's maybe we should be doing that. Then Obama's tenure, bombs to the Middle East, and then Trump's maybe we should be doing that. Then Trump's tenure, bombs to the Middle East, and then I have the curse words saying, when does it end? It doesn't really matter what figurehead is in power. The U.S. is going to bomb the shit out of the Middle East regardless of which figure is in power. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have the hero complex of MAGA, how loyalty turned into tyranny, from the Rational League, Substack.com, posted by Ref Libman. And yeah, personally, I feel somewhat sympathetic to the MAGA movement as a way of getting back against the establishment. But with that being said, they've very much become the establishment that they swore to destroy. It's they're still going to bomb the Middle East. They'll still spend like there's no tomorrow, etc., etc. And that just goes to show you, they might market themselves as being against the establishment, but they're really just the edgy version of the establishment. And yeah, it might seem like I sympathize with their message of trying to get away from whatever the official power structure. But it just goes to show you how regardless of how people market themselves, they usually end up when it's just another establishment candidate when they're in office. There are some exceptions, I would say, like Thomas Massey or Rand Paul, who, I would say are good at sticking true to their principles as well, trying not to draw Trump's ire too much, because if you draw Trump's ire, you too much on Trump's bad side, you end up irrelevant like Jeff Flake or Liz Cheney. But regardless, it just goes to show you how, people might say that they're gonna change things or shake things up, like Obama ran on change and then Trump ran on shaking things up. But just to show you, when they actually get there, Washington will never change, even if that's pretty much the politician's entire campaign to do so. Then we have Massey is right in finally calling out the warmongering president from Donald Key, and that's crosspost from the Facepalm subreddit. GOP representatives are calling Trump out for his non-congressional sanctioned attack on Iran, and that's Thomas Massey quote tweeting Donald Trump, who Donald Trump tweeted a picture of his troops. We have completed a very successful attack on the free nuclear sites in Iran, including Fordow, Natanz, and Esfahan. All planes are now outside of Iran airspace. A full payload of bombs was dropped on the primary site, Fordow. All planes are safely on their way home. Congratulations to our great American warriors. There is not another military in the world that could have done this. Now is the time for peace. Thank you for your attention to this matter. And Thomas Massey's quote tweet was, "This is not constitutional." And I'd agree with that. It just goes to show you that, in the Constitution, when there's really no mechanisms to enforce the Constitution, it's pretty much worthless. And, yeah, that's just why, it doesn't really matter, as I said, who's in power. They'll just bomb the Middle East regardless. And it goes to show you, Pakistan just nominated Donald Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize. I had a good tweet about that. I quote tweeted them. I said, he definitely doesn't deserve it after this Israel-Iran spat, but at least it would make the Reddit progs cry. And yeah, I definitely don't really care for Donald Trump. Outside of pissing off Redditors, he's pretty much just edgy George W. Bush. He'll just bomb the Middle East like there's no tomorrow, spend like there's no tomorrow, etc., etc. And yeah, you get tired of it after a while. He's just gonna do the same thing as his predecessor and successor and all that. And it just goes to show you there's never going to be change as long as the duopoly holds power. And we have America slides into totalitarianism, and it won't be easy to reverse, from Salon.com, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, personally, I don't. It seems like it seems like outlets like Salon have about the same story for like 10 years running now. And yeah, I personally do think Trump's kind of a totalitarian authoritarian, but they would never call out people on their side as totalitarian authoritarians like Biden or Obama. And that just goes to show you they're just another partisan media outlet. Just pretty much pumping out the official DNC narrative while pretending to be progressive. Then we have Senate parliamentarian strikes down scheme to block use of courts as a check on unbridled executive power, from Patan 14. And that's a post from Freds. From Mark E. Elias. News, Senate parliamentarian says GOP scheme to limit federal court preliminary injunctions by requiring plaintiffs challenging government actions to post large bonds cannot be part of the reconciliation bill. A victory for Democrats, rule of law in the courts, and a defeat for Trump and the GOP. And yeah, personally, I don't really care too much because, the Reddit's always going to be doomer, that Trump's always winning, because, they just had that, and they wrote against the trans rights things in that New Scrimeti case, but, whenever Reddit, it's like whenever the courts rule against Reddit, they're illegitimate, but whenever they rule for Reddit, it upholds the rule of law, and it's the best thing ever. So it just goes to show you how, Reddit, they have no values other than, whatever the current progressive narrative is. If the progressive narrative says the courts are good, they're good. If it says they're bad, and they don't really have any principles other than that. Whatever, yeah. Then we have Vance. I emphasize with Americans who are exhausted after 25 years of foreign entanglements in the Middle East. I understand the concern, but the difference is that back then we had dumb presidents. And that's posted by Legioax, and that's a Blue Sky post from Asen. And yeah, I personally don't really, I don't really care for this. I think we still kind of do have dumb presidents. But they're really just figureheads, and it just doesn't really matter who's in power. They'll just bomb the Middle East regardless. I'm pretty sure Vance, he's a guy who also likes to market himself as a dove, but, he'll probably end up just as hawkish if he ever has to take charge, if Trump ever gets assassinated, or if he gets elected after his term ends in 2028. So it just goes to show you how, it doesn't really matter who you vote for, you always end up with John McCain, regardless of what rhetoric they use at any given time. Then we have talking points have been delivered from Toast by Donkey, and that's a bunch of tweets from TMK. If you're no longer MAGA because Trump wiped out Iran's nuclear sites, you were never MAGA to begin with. Gun for Eagleman, if you were upset that Trump took out Obama's nuclear facilities in Iran, you were never MAGA. Vale, if you're no longer MAGA because Trump wiped out Iran's nuclear sites, you were never MAGA in the first place. Baron Trump, I may have said a lot of people this, but if you're no longer MAGA because Trump wiped out Iran's nuclear sites, you were never MAGA to begin with. Giordano Bruno, if you're no longer MAGA because President Trump wiped out Iran's nuclear sites, you were never MAGA to begin with. And yeah, that just goes to show you increasingly political influencers, whether they be MAGA or DNC, increasingly just to go whatever the official script is. And yeah, it's not something I particularly care for. It's why increasingly it seems like the internet's just all bots at this point, because everyone always says the same official narrative again and again, and it's like they hand out talking points. They all read off the same script like this. And yeah, it's not something I personally think people need to learn more to think for themselves and make their own talking points rather than just go off whatever the official talking points or script is. But ultimately, it just seems like people are getting more tribal and up their own party's asses when it comes to their party justifying whatever their party does, and that's not something that I think is very libertarian. I think libertarians should be sticking to principle over party. That's why the Libertarian Party is the party of principle. We need people who stick with their values and principles rather than whoever just follows whatever the current narrative is. And that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're going to wrap up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.